There exists within the human psyche a pleasure so seductive, so psychologically intoxicating, that it can consume an entire life while masquerading as virtue. This is not the obvious addiction to substances or the transparent hunger for material possessions. This is something far more sophisticated and infinitely more dangerous, the addictive pleasure of being needed, the euphoric high of indispensability, the intoxicating rush that comes from being the solution to someone else's problems. If you have ever felt a secret thrill when someone declared they couldn't live without you, if you have ever experienced a warm satisfaction when others turn to you in crisis, if you have ever derived a sense of identity from being the person everyone depends on, then you have tasted this dangerous drug and may already be under its influence. Jung understood what modern psychology often overlooks, that the pleasure of being needed is not love, but a sophisticated form of psychological narcissism, not service, but a subtle form of control, not generosity, but a complex strategy for avoiding the terrifying vulnerability of being genuinely seen and loved for who you are, rather than what you provide. The person addicted to being needed has confused their worth with their utility, their identity with their function, their value with their indispensability. They have made themselves into human Swiss Army knives, believing that their complexity and usefulness guarantee their place in others' lives. This addiction operates through what I call necessity narcissism, the unconscious belief that your importance is measured by how much others depend on you, that your security comes from their neediness, that your worth is proven by their inability to function without your intervention. The needed person becomes a dealer of their own services, creating dependencies in others that mirror their own dependency on being depended upon. They do not help others become stronger. They help others stay weak enough to continue needing them. The pleasure centers of the brain that respond to being needed are the same ones activated by gambling, substances, and other addictive behaviors. When someone says, "I don't know what I'd do without you," the needed person experiences a neurochemical reward that reinforces the behavior that created the dependency. They become addicted to the phrase, "You're the only one who understands me," intoxicated by declarations of "I need you," dependent on the regular fixes of gratitude and appreciation that come from being indispensable to others' functioning. But like all addictions, the pleasure of being needed requires increasingly larger doses to achieve the same satisfaction. The person begins with helping friends through minor crises and eventually requires major catastrophes to feel the same level of importance. They escalate from being occasionally helpful to being chronically indispensable, from solving problems to unconsciously enabling the creation of new problems that will require their intervention. They become what Jung might have called professional victims of others' helplessness. And this addiction manifests in what I call rescue fantasy fulfillment, the unconscious belief that they are uniquely qualified to save others, specially equipped to solve problems that no one else can handle, divinely appointed to be the answer to everyone's prayers. They develop what amounts to a messiah complex disguised as helpfulness, a grandiose fantasy masked as humility. They see themselves not as ordinary humans offering ordinary assistance, but as special beings whose intervention can transform other people's lives. The needed person learns to read others' vulnerabilities with the precision of a predator, not to harm, but to help in ways that create dependency rather than independence. They become expert at identifying people's weak spots, emotional wounds, and areas of incompetence, not to exploit these vulnerabilities maliciously, but to position themselves as the irreplaceable solution. They offer help that helps, but also hooks, support that sustains, but also enslaves, care that nurtures, but also controls. Perhaps most insidiously, this addiction creates what I call enabling as love, the unconscious equation of creating dependency with creating connection. The needed person believes that making others dependent on them is the same as making others love them, that being indispensable is equivalent to being beloved, that their security in relationships comes from others' inability to leave rather than others' desire to stay. They confuse emotional hostage-taking with emotional intimacy, psychological imprisonment with psychological partnership. Beneath the noble facade of helping others lies a complex psychological economy that Jung would have recognized as one of the most sophisticated shadow operations the human psyche can devise. The emotional labor market, where the needed person becomes both merchant and product, seller and commodity, dealer and drug. This shadow economy operates on a currency system where care is traded for control, help is exchanged for importance, and support is bartered for psychological dominance. The person addicted to being needed has become an emotional capitalist, building an empire based on others' deficiencies while disguising their exploitation as generosity. This shadow economy functions through what I call deficit creation. The needed person unconsciously works to maintain or even amplify others' weaknesses, limitations, and dependencies because these deficits represent their market share, their competitive advantage, their source of psychological income. They do not want their clients to become fully functional because functional people do not require constant intervention. They need others to remain somewhat broken, somewhat helpless, somewhat dependent to justify their own sense of importance and maintain their position as indispensable problem solver. The needed person develops what Jung might have called an investment strategy in others' incapacity. They put their time, energy, and resources into people who will provide the highest return on emotional investment, meaning those who will remain most grateful, most dependent, most likely to continue requiring their services. They unconsciously gravitate toward individuals who are unlikely to grow beyond their need for help, who will provide steady demand for their supply of solutions, who will offer consistent validation for their helping identity. This creates what I call therapeutic codependency, relationships that masquerade as healing partnerships but actually function as mutual exploitation systems. The needed person gets their fix of importance and indispensability, while the helped person gets to remain irresponsible for their own growth and development. Both parties become addicted to a dynamic that prevents authentic development while providing the illusion of progress and care. The shadow economics also operate through gratitude manipulation. The needed person learns to create situations where others feel indebted to their generosity, obligated by their kindness, bound by their sacrifice. They give in ways that create psychological debt rather than psychological freedom, help that hooks rather than heals, support that enslaves rather than empowers. They become loan sharks of emotional labor, offering assistance at interest rates that can never be fully repaid. Perhaps most insidiously, this shadow economy creates what I call competency suppression. The needed person unconsciously undermines others' confidence in their own abilities to solve problems, make decisions, or handle challenges independently. They subtly communicate that the other person lacks the wisdom, strength, or capability to manage their own life effectively. They position themselves as possessing superior judgment, greater emotional intelligence, more reliable problem-solving skills, creating a psychological hierarchy where they remain permanently on top. The needed person also practices crisis cultivation. They unconsciously encourage or amplify dramatic situations because crisis creates the emotional intensity and urgent need that feeds their addiction. They may not create problems directly, but they certainly don't discourage their development. They become what Jung might have called catastrophe farmers, growing fields of other people's difficulties that they can then harvest for their own psychological nourishment. This shadow economy extends to what I call advice inflation. The needed person begins to see their insights, opinions, and suggestions as more valuable than they actually are. They develop an inflated sense of their own wisdom, while simultaneously developing a deflated view of others' capabilities. They begin to believe that their perspective is essential for others' well-being, that their guidance is crucial for others' success, that their involvement is necessary for others' happiness. The most dangerous aspect of this shadow economy is how it corrupts genuine care into manipulative control. What begins as authentic desire to help others gradually transforms into a sophisticated system for maintaining psychological dominance while appearing virtuous. The needed person learns to give in ways that bind rather than free, to care in ways that control rather than liberate, to love in ways that limit rather than expand the growth and autonomy of those they claim to serve. At the core of the addiction to being needed lies what Jung identified as one of the most seductive and destructive forms of archetypal possession: the savior complex, a psychological structure so sophisticated in its organization and so compelling in its promises that it can consume an entire personality while convincing its host that they are engaged in the highest form of human service. This is not the conscious choice to help others occasionally, but the unconscious organization of one's entire identity around being the rescuer, the fixer, the one who swoops in to save others from their own limitations, mistakes, and suffering. The savior complex operates through what I call messianic inflation, the unconscious identification with archetypal energies of divine intervention, miraculous healing, and supernatural rescue. The person possessed by this complex begins to see themselves not as an ordinary human offering ordinary assistance, but as a chosen vessel for extraordinary healing, a special being whose very presence can transform other people's lives. They develop what amounts to a God complex disguised as humility, grandiose fantasies masked as selfless service. This psychological architecture is built upon what Jung would recognize as wounded healer syndrome, the unconscious belief that their own pain qualifies them to heal others' pain, that their own struggles give them special insight into others' struggles, that their own recovery makes them uniquely equipped to guide others' recovery. But this wounded healer energy becomes corrupted when it inflates into the belief that they are not just fellow travelers on the path of healing, but appointed guides with superior wisdom and special powers. The savior complex creates what I call rescue addiction, the compulsive need to find people who need saving, problems that require solving, crises that demand intervention. The person becomes like a psychological ambulance chaser, unconsciously drawn to dysfunction, drama, and distress, because these situations provide the raw material for their savior fantasies. They cannot tolerate peace, stability, or others' competence, because these conditions do not require their intervention and therefore do not feed their complex. This complex also manifests through superiority disguised as service. The savior develops an unconscious sense of being above those they help, more evolved than those they serve, more capable than those they rescue. They position themselves as the answer to others' problems while remaining blind to their own, as the solution to others' dysfunction while perpetuating their own, as the healer of others' wounds while keeping their own carefully hidden beneath their helping persona. The savior complex operates through what Jung called projection of the inferior function. The savior sees in others the helplessness, incompetence, and neediness that they cannot acknowledge in themselves. They project their own unhealed wounds onto others and then attempt to heal these projected aspects through their rescuing activities. They are not actually helping others, but using others as screens for healing their own disowned parts through proxy. Perhaps most dangerously, the savior complex creates what I call therapeutic vampirism. The savior feeds off others' gratitude, dependency, and improvement as sources of their own psychological nourishment. They need others to be grateful to feel valuable, others to be dependent to feel important, others to improve to feel powerful. Their helping becomes a form of emotional extraction where they take psychological sustenance from others' vulnerability while appearing to give. The complex also employs crisis magnetism. The savior unconsciously attracts people who are in various states of emergency, trauma, or dysfunction. They develop what amounts to a psychological beacon that draws the wounded, the broken, the needy like moths to flame. They surround themselves with people who require constant assistance, creating a perpetual state of emergency that justifies their savior identity while providing endless opportunities to feel indispensable. The savior complex becomes particularly insidious when it learns to disguise itself as spiritual evolution, therapeutic training, or professional calling. The person begins to believe that their compulsive rescuing is evidence of their compassion, their inability to say no proof of their caring nature, their chronic involvement in others' problems demonstration of their evolved consciousness. They mistake their psychological compulsion for spiritual calling, their archetypal possession for divine purpose. The architecture of this complex is self-reinforcing because it provides both the problem and the solution. The savior creates or maintains the very dependencies that require their intervention, then feels validated by their ability to provide that intervention. They become both the arsonist and the firefighter, both the cause of the dependency and the cure for it, trapped in a cycle where their helping perpetuates the very helplessness it claims to address. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the addiction to being needed is how it serves as an elaborate defense against the very thing the human soul most deeply craves: authentic intimacy, genuine connection, and the vulnerable experience of being loved for who you are rather than what you provide. Jung understood that many people organize their entire relational life around being useful because being useful feels safer than being real. Providing services feels less risky than sharing self, and maintaining functional roles feels more predictable than engaging in the chaotic vulnerability that authentic love requires. The person addicted to being needed has unconsciously discovered that staying in the helper role protects them from the terrifying exposure that comes with reciprocal relationship. When they are always the giver and never the receiver, always the strong one and never the vulnerable one, always the solution and never the problem, they maintain a psychological distance that shields them from being truly seen, truly known, truly encountered in their full humanity. They use their indispensability as armor against intimacy, their usefulness as a wall against genuine connection. This creates what I call functional intimacy, relationships that feel close because of their intensity and frequency, but remain fundamentally superficial because they are organized around role rather than essence, function rather than being, utility rather than authenticity. The needed person knows others' problems intimately, but remains unknown in their own complexity. They are familiar with others' wounds, but keep their own carefully hidden. They are experts on others' needs, but strangers to their own. The addiction to being needed also serves as what Jung might have called a defense against reciprocal vulnerability. When someone offers to help the helper, to support the supporter, to care for the caregiver, the needed person often feels profoundly uncomfortable, even anxious. They deflect offers of assistance, minimize their own needs, redirect attention back to others' problems. They have organized their identity so completely around giving that receiving feels foreign, threatening, even shameful. This pattern creates what I call asymmetrical relationships, connections where emotional labor, care, and attention flow in only one direction. The needed person surrounds themselves with people who take their help, but never offer equivalent support in return. They choose friends who share their problems, but show little interest in the helper's inner world. They attract partners who depend on their strength, but cannot handle their weakness. These relationships feel intense and important, but lack the reciprocal exchange that creates genuine intimacy. The addiction also functions as performance-based love insurance. The unconscious belief that if they can make themselves indispensable enough, useful enough, helpful enough, they can guarantee that others will never leave them. They operate from the terror that if they stopped being useful, they would become disposable. Their helping becomes a desperate attempt to earn security in relationships through service rather than risk the uncertainty of being loved simply for existing. But perhaps most tragically, this pattern prevents the needed person from ever discovering whether others love them for who they are or merely appreciate them for what they do. They remain forever uncertain whether their relationships are based on genuine affection or convenient utility. They live with the haunting question, would you still want me if I stopped helping you? But they are too terrified of the answer to ever test it by actually stopping. The intimacy avoidance also manifests as what I call emotional labor inequality. The needed person provides therapeutic-level support to others while never receiving equivalent care in return. They listen to others' problems for hours, but have no one who listens to theirs. They offer deep empathy and understanding, but receive only surface-level acknowledgement in return. They give their presence fully while receiving others' distracted, half-hearted attention. This creates a profound loneliness, disguised as connection. The needed person is surrounded by people who appreciate them, but feels fundamentally alone because no one truly knows them. They have many people who value their services, but few who understand their soul. They are beloved for their function, but remain invisible in their essence, creating what amounts to the loneliness of the perpetually useful but never truly seen. The defense against intimacy becomes so sophisticated that the needed person often loses contact with their own emotional needs, their own vulnerabilities, their own desires for support and care. They become so identified with the helper role that they forget they are also human beings who need help, support, understanding, and care from others. We arrive now at the most challenging and essential threshold in the journey away from the dangerous pleasure of being needed, the sacred withdrawal from the addictive cycle of indispensability and the courageous reclamation of authentic selfhood that exists independent of utility, function, or service to others. This transformation requires what Jung called the sacrifice of the persona, the willingness to release the identity that has provided meaning, purpose, and validation in order to discover who you are when you are not needed, who you become when you are not useful, what remains when you stop being indispensable. This withdrawal begins with what I call conscious recognition of the addiction, the brutal honesty to acknowledge that your helping has become compulsive rather than conscious, that your giving has become self-serving rather than selfless, that your care has become controlling rather than liberating. This recognition is often accompanied by profound shame as the needed person confronts the reality that their most cherished virtue has been corrupted into their most sophisticated vice, that their greatest source of pride has been their greatest limitation. The process requires what Jung understood as active disappointment of others, the willingness to let people down who have become dependent on your constant availability, to refuse requests that you have always automatically fulfilled, to step back from roles that have defined your identity for years or even decades. This disappointment feels like cruelty to someone whose entire sense of worth has been built on never disappointing anyone. But it is actually the beginning of authentic love, love that empowers rather than enables, that challenges rather than coddles, that promotes growth rather than perpetuates dependency. The sacred withdrawal demands what I call tolerance for others' incompetence, allowing people to struggle with problems you could easily solve, to make mistakes you could help them avoid, to learn lessons you could teach them more efficiently. This requires overcoming the arrogance disguised as helpfulness, the superiority masked as service, the grandiosity that believes your intervention is necessary for others' well-being. It means trusting that others are more capable than your addiction has allowed you to believe. Perhaps most terrifyingly, this process requires facing what Jung called the fear of abandonment through uselessness, confronting the possibility that if you are not needed, you may not be wanted, that if you are not useful, you may be dispensable, that if you stop serving others, they may stop valuing you. This fear drives the addiction because it touches the deepest wound of the needed person, the terror of being loved for their essence rather than their function, of being chosen for who they are rather than what they provide. The reclamation of self involves developing what I call generative rather than reactive helping, learning to offer assistance from fullness rather than emptiness, from choice rather than compulsion, from love rather than fear. The liberated person helps when helping serves both parties, refuses when helping would harm either party, and maintains the capacity to distinguish between genuine need and manufactured dependency. Their giving becomes authentic because it arises from genuine care rather than psychological addiction. This transformation also requires cultivating what Jung called comfortable uselessness, the ability to exist in relationships without constantly proving your value through service, to be present without always providing solutions, to connect without always being helpful. This involves developing tolerance for the anxiety that arises when you are not actively fixing, solving, or rescuing, learning to find peace in simply being rather than constantly doing. The liberated person discovers what I call reciprocal intimacy, relationships based on mutual exchange rather than one-way service, connections where both parties give and receive, care and are cared for, support and are supported. These relationships feel foreign at first to someone accustomed to asymmetrical dynamics, but they provide the authentic nourishment that functional relationships never could. Perhaps most importantly, the person freed from the addiction to being needed develops what Jung called inner authority, the capacity to derive worth from their inherent value as a human being rather than their utility as a problem solver. They learn that their worth is not negotiable, not dependent on others' approval or gratitude, not contingent on their ability to be useful. They discover that love, based on being rather than doing, is not only possible but far more satisfying than the hollow substitute they had mistaken for connection. The dangerous pleasure of being needed transforms into the sacred joy of being authentic. The addictive high of indispensability evolves into the sustainable peace of genuine intimacy, and the person finally learns the difference between being used and being loved, between being needed and being wanted, between serving others and serving life itself. Your worth is not your usefulness. Your value is not your function. Your love is not your service. You are enough exactly as you are, without fixing anyone, without solving anything, without being needed by everyone. The most generous thing you can offer the world is not your endless availability, but your authentic presence, not your constant help, but your genuine self. If you recognize yourself in this dangerous pleasure, if you feel the uncomfortable truth of your addiction to being needed reflected in these words, then your liberation begins with the most terrifying and necessary act. Disappoint someone today, not because you want to be cruel, but because you want to be real, not because you want to hurt others, but because you want to heal yourself. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready to explore the deeper psychological patterns that keep you trapped in relationships where you're valued for what you do rather than who you are. Share this video with someone else who needs to understand that their compulsive helping isn't virtue. It's a sophisticated form of control disguised as care. And most importantly, practice this today. Identify one person who has become dependent on your constant availability, your endless solutions, your perpetual rescue. Say no to their next request for help. Feel the terror of being seen as selfish and do it anyway. Discover that you can survive disappointing someone who has learned to depend on your addiction to being needed. Your helping has become your hiding. Your service has become your shield. Your indispensability has become your prison. The people who truly love you want you to stop performing usefulness and start revealing authenticity. Stop being needed and start being known. Stop being indispensable and start being intimate. Stop serving others' dependencies and start honoring your own humanity. The world doesn't need another person addicted to being needed. It needs you to discover who you are when you're not fixing everyone else's life, and then be brave enough to show that person to the world. Your worth was never your usefulness. Start acting like you know that.